The Royal Air Force came into being on the first day of April 1918, when the Royal Flying Corps and the Royal Naval Air Service amalgamated into one force. From its very first day, the RAF was occupied in a critical stage of one of the most prolonged wars in the history of civilization. Since that day, the Royal Air Force has rarely been able to enjoy a non-operational period of service. The history of the RAF is essentially a record of men and their machines, from the early pioneering days of string and canvas to the present-day sophisticated computerization. But predominantly, this history is an account of men and their unconquerable spirit. For the aircraft are only part of the story. They couldn't function without a human pressing the first button or flicking the first switch. Accordingly, this account is one of men's deeds, courage and foresight, and above all, their sacrifices. It's also a story of many triumphs over the most difficult obstacles. There's an old adage that old men make wars, young men fight them. The young men and women of the RAF have for the greater part of this century served their country magnificently.
During the course of the First World War, the use of aircraft as a weapon against the enemy had rapidly increased. And although the British Army had originally been sceptical about the first motley squadrons from the Royal Flying Corps, doubting their effectiveness in combat, their worth very soon became apparent. By 1917, the Royal Flying Corps and the Royal Naval Air Service had grown to such an extent, with further expansion proposed, that problems started to develop in organization. Both the War Office and the Admiralty believed that they, respectively, should have paramount influence on air matters.
The Prime Minister, Lloyd George, decided differently and invited an impartial assessment of the situation from an outsider. His choice was the eminent South African Lieutenant General Jan Smuts. In his report in August 1917, Smuts recommended the setting up of an independent organization with a separate air ministry and a separate air staff. This report was approved by the War Ministry, and a bill was quickly effected and passed through Parliament. On the first day of April 1918, with Major General Sir Hugh Trenchard being appointed as the first Chief of Air Staff, the Royal Air Force came into being.
For the next 7 months remaining in the war, the RAF faced many battles, mainly from German fighters attacking reconnaissance aircraft and bombers. In June 1918, the Independent Bombing Force was introduced into the RAF, which continued on a course of long-range strategic bombing. Although these attacks were light by later standards, they set a pattern which governed the RAF's way of thinking in the future. By July, much of the German offensive petered out. A few RAF squadrons were dispatched to Italy to support the armies which were fighting the Austrian forces. The Allies went over to an all-out general offensive in September 1918, and with German resources exhausted and Austria's defences crumbling, a surrender was imminent. The Austrians accepted terms on the 3rd of November, and the Germans soon followed by signing the armistice on the 11th of November. The carnage of the Great War had now come to an end. In November 1918, the strength of the Royal Air Force amounted to about 27,500 officers and 264,000 other ranks. There were also 25,000 women in the Women's Royal Air Force. The squadrons amounted to over 22,500 aircraft, including some 3,300, which were still in the front line, and over 100 airships. This enormous force, necessary in wartime, could inevitably not be supported during peacetime, and in the wake of post-war depression, most of the squadrons were quickly wound down and disbanded. Men and women were demobilized, and even the Chief of Air Staff, Sir Hugh Trenchard, lost his job. Thousands of aircraft were scrapped, or where possible, sold off for conversion to civilian roles. The independent bombing force was disbanded, outstanding contracts with manufacturers were cancelled, and many companies in the aircraft industries faced a bleak future of closure or liquidation. The streamlined force that now remained was split into three separate groups: the northern area, the southern area, and the coastal area.
The whole future of the RAF as Britain's third military force was now shadowed by doubt. There was a danger that it was to be broken up completely and its squadrons handed over to the Army or the Navy. It was Winston Churchill, a man who publicly showed detestation for air warfare and the bombing of innocent civilians, who was largely responsible for the RAF's salvation. When he was appointed Secretary of State for War and Air in January 1919, he showed his irrefutable quality of far-sightedness by inviting Sir Hugh Trenchard back to retain his old post as Chief of the Air Staff. Trenchard was a single-minded commander, highly determined and with a strong sense of purpose. He soon put into operation a plan to put the structure of the RAF onto a permanent basis.
Trenchard, in his reinstated position, very quickly realized that public interest and support was essential if the RAF was to survive as a peacetime force. In one of his remarkably astute exercises in public relations, he opened the very first RAF air show at Hendon on the 3rd of July 1920. The show could not have been timed better, for the public had started to become increasingly aware of aviation. Alcock and Brown had recently made their crossing of the Atlantic in a Vickers Vimy, and the RAF had followed by making the same journey in an airship and back again, following which a four-man team had flown in a converted Vickers Vimy all the way from England to Australia. The public turned out to the Hendon Air Show in their thousands and were duly captivated by the skills of the RAF pilots, giving displays of aerobatics, mock bombing and close formation flying. Public support for the RAF was now established, and the Hendon pageant became an annual event with ever-increasing crowds turning out for the displays. With the future of the RAF now becoming more certain, Trenchard set about implementing his plans for the years ahead.
In 1927, Trenchard became the very first Marshal of the Royal Air Force. 2 years later, it was time for him to retire. But the RAF could not bear to part with the man who'd saved their force from virtual disbandment. A new resolution was quickly passed, one which was to stand until this very day. It decreed that the holders of their highest rank should never retire, but stay on the active list for the rest of their lives. Trenchard's place was taken by one of his lieutenants, Sir John Salmond, but his period of tenure was short and uneventful. In 1933, Sir Edward Ellington took over the position. And although Ellington didn't have the charisma of Trenchard, he certainly played a key role in the history of the RAF. He proved to be a superb staff officer who presided over the technical revolution which shaped the RAF of the Second World War.
By 1934, the original plan for a force of 52 squadrons had still not been completely implemented. Only 42 had been established, with a first-line strength of 488 aircraft. Against opposition in Parliament, the government decided to embark upon a further expansion program. The RAF was to increase as soon as possible to 75 squadrons, and within the next 5 years to a total of 128 squadrons. This policy came about through the belief that air bombardment alone could win a war, and that Britain should be equipped with a force capable of getting the first major attacks. The RAF up until this period had been mainly equipped with biplanes, military thinking being that they were safer than the monoplanes which were being developed by the civilian airliner companies.
However, under the command of Ellington, the situation had started to change, and the RAF began to introduce a new type of aircraft. The squadrons were taking delivery of much faster and much heavier aircraft. These included the Wellington, the Anson, the Wellesley, the Whitley, the Hampden, the Blenheim and the Sunderland flying boat.
The Wellington prototype made its maiden flight in June 1936 from the Vickers factory at Brooklands after 3 years of development under the designer Barnes Wallis. Orders for the type quickly followed from the RAF, and the Mark I variant first flew in December 1937. Vicker's target was to produce one new aircraft every single day, and as demand increased, new factories were established at Chester and Blackpool, increasing the output to over 180 aircraft a month. During the peak of the war, this was to increase to over 300 a month. As production continued, modifications were made, and throughout its service the Wellington appeared in a variety of different marks and variants. They were fitted with a number of power units ranging from 850 to 1600 horsepower, and the later variants could carry a bomb load far in excess of the original requirement. The Mark I, carrying a crew of 6, could cruise at 267 miles per hour at 15,000 feet for more than 3,000 miles. The first bomber variant entered operational service in October 1938 and was delivered to No. 99 Squadron at Mildenhall. By the outbreak of war, almost a year later, the RAF had no less than 6 Wellington squadrons, and within 24 hours of the outbreak of hostilities, they were in action in the first RAF attack against Germany. Rugged and reliable, the Wellington, or the Wimpy as it became affectionately known, was operated by bomber, coastal and transport commands. It served in almost every theatre of war, for it possessed a level of versatility which was difficult to match. Ease of handling and good performance, combined with the enormous strength of its geodetic frame, made the Wellington universally popular with its crews. By 1945, almost 11,500 machines had been built, but even before the last one rolled off the Vickers production line, the Wimpy had secured its place as one of the great aircraft in RAF history.
The Bomber Command headquarters decided on these very large raids, 1,000 bombers, and in order to make up the numbers, they enlisted the training unit, so we found that we were suddenly on operations at the training unit. One of the intriguing features about it was it did have a longish range, and the engines didn't really have enough oil to last that long. So there was an auxiliary oil tank in the fuselage, and one of the jobs of the wireless operator was in fact about halfway through the flight to pump some more oil out to the engines. And there was a hand pump in the fuselage which he had to go back and forth on. It led to some rather good barroom songs about delivering the goods on the 49th stroke and things like that.
Just as much as the Wellington was loved by its crews, so too was the Bristol Blenheim. This revolutionary aircraft was first conceived by Lord Rothermere in the early 1930s, but not as a warplane. It was designed as a high-performance executive passenger plane. When the RAF took delivery of the first military variant in 1937, it was at that time the fastest and most advanced aircraft in the force. 2 years later, more than 1,000 were in service, and by the outbreak of war, the Blenheim outnumbered every other type of RAF aircraft. As the mainstay of Britain's offensive power, this twin-engine bomber was destined to bear the brunt of much of the early fighting. However, with aviation technology at the beginning of the war advancing at breakneck speed, the Blenheim was soon to be outgunned by Germany's front-line fighters, and subsequently Blenheim losses in the first 2 years of the war were simply appalling. Often sent on operations for which the machine was unsuited, the Blenheim crews suffered one of the highest casualty rates of all RAF crews, serving on any type of aircraft in World War II. But despite the heavy losses, the aircraft inspired fierce crew loyalty, and the aircraft continued to play its part faithfully. Not just as a bomber, but also as a fighter, flying missions day and night, the achievements of this elegant machine were many and distinguished. It was the first British aircraft to cross the German frontier and made the very first attack on a German warship, the Admiral Scheer. It was the first aircraft to take part in an offensive aerial action, and also the first to carry out a night intruder sortie. The Blenheim pioneered the development of airborne radar and carried out the first ever successful radar interception at night. It sank the very first U-boat and went on to become the only RAF aircraft to serve on every front in every RAF command. And as for the crews, their bravery was unmatched. Time after time, they pressed home attacks against odds that were virtually suicidal, highlighted by the fact that the Victoria Cross was awarded to more Blenheim pilots than to Spitfire and Hurricane pilots put together.
far as I'm concerned, it was the greatest. It was, well, I don't know, I wouldn't have missed it for anything. And I don't know of many blending people who would. I don't think you'll find many blending people who say it was a cow of an aircraft, or whatever expression I like to use, because, I don't know, I think it was wonderful.
Oh, it was a beautiful machine to fly. You could turn on a sixpence with it. Lovely turning circle, which was very useful if you met any enemy aircraft.
The short Sunderland was designed as a response to an Air Ministry specification for a 4-engine monoplane urgently needed to replace the aging Singapore maritime reconnaissance aircraft. Making its maiden flight in October 1937, it was first delivered to the RAF less than a year later. 230 Squadron in Singapore and 210 Squadron at Pembroke Dock were the first squadrons to take delivery. The initial reaction by the crews was one of amazement. The sheer size and cavernous hull was something they had never encountered before. With a wingspan of over 112 feet and an overall length of 84 feet, the boat towered 33 feet above the ground when it was out of the water. The Sunderland was a vast improvement over its predecessors. With a maximum speed of 210 miles per hour, it was 70 miles per hour faster than the Singapore, and it could climb at over 1,200 feet per minute to its service ceiling of 20,000 feet. By 1939, the RAF had 40 machines in service, and as the hostilities got underway, the Sunderlands began to perform the kind of operation for which they were ideally suited: the long and tiring maritime patrols over endless miles of ocean. The type underwent 5 different marks throughout its career with the RAF, and was one of the very few types to remain in operational service throughout the entire period, and the only RAF aircraft to perform frontline duties for the whole of the much later Korean War. As a tough and reliable workhorse, with its solid design and large carrying capacity, and also its powerful defensive and offensive armament, the Sunderland had an unrivaled ability to succeed in a variety of roles. Much loved by its crews and highly respected by its enemies, the Sunderland became a legendary campaigner, and of all the flying boats to serve with the RAF, it was undoubtedly the finest.
So, with these and other new aircraft at their disposal, and with all the rapid expansion plans being put into operation, and of course the opening of new airfields all over the country, the RAF now looked as though it was going to be once again a force to be reckoned with by would-be aggressors.
For the fighter squadrons, there was little change, but the far-seeing Sir Edward Ellington had already decided that the aging Gloucester Gauntlet and Gladiator biplanes needed replacing. Ellington, as did many of the other powers at the time, felt more than uneasy about the changing situation in Europe. Hitler had taken power in Germany, and against the Treaty of Versailles, he had formed the Luftwaffe, with an infamous pilot from the First World War, Goering, as its commander-in-chief. The Luftwaffe possessed over 1,800 aircraft. Ellington headed a team which issued 3 major specifications for the RAF's future aircraft, which he considered to be vital if the RAF were to have any effect in a war which he felt was brewing. The first of these was for a fast and maneuverable fighter which could carry a minimum of 8 machine guns compared to the biplane's 4. 2 aircraft manufacturers responded to this specification.
The 2 new aircraft, both of which predominantly used the Merlin engine, were, in the years that followed, going to write their own chapter in the history of the RAF. From Hawker came the Hurricane, which entered service with the RAF in 1937. From Supermarine came the legendary Spitfire, which entered service in 1938.
The Hawker Hurricane, designed by Sidney Cam, was the RAF's very first monoplane fighter, and their very first combat aircraft capable of speeds in excess of 300 miles per hour in level flight. But what little the Hurricane lacked in speed over the Spitfire, it gained in versatility. The Hurricane was the synthesis of many years of fighter biplane design translated into a modern formula, a compromise between tradition and new requirements. Whereas the Supermarine Spitfire, designed by R.J. Mitchell, was both an inspired design and the outcome of a lengthy development process dating back as far as the Supermarine S6B, which had previously won the Schneider Trophy and had also held the world airspeed record. Both aircraft went through many variants and marques during their service careers. The Spitfire no less than 40, and both aircraft were powered by the mighty Merlin engine. Both aircraft performed with outstanding capabilities, and no matter what role the aircraft were placed in, they fulfilled the tasks with distinction. The fighter pilots, of course, had their preference, but what was truly apparent was that from the moment of their both entering service, the RAF had two combat aircraft that were going to make a great contribution to any war in the skies.
The second specification was for the development of a four-engined heavy bomber, which could carry a far heavier bomb load than any of the twin-engined aircraft now in service. The third was for a mid-wing, two-engined medium-heavy bomber, but unlike its wood and canvas predecessors, this new design was to be all metal.
With the ever-increasing threat of another war, it was now time for this new Air Force to implement new structural alterations within its own administration. In the UK, this meant dividing the RAF into separate commands according to function. A training command was established, whilst the operational groups were split into bomber, fighter, and coastal commands. Overseas, there were 5 more: the Middle East, the Mediterranean, India, Aden, and the Far East. All of these commands were responsible to the Chief of Air Staff via the Air Council. Each command controlled regional groups, which administered their own stations, which in turn administered squadrons. This was the structure of the Royal Air Force, which was to fight the Second World War. The RAF's airfields, or aerodromes as they were then known, were increased from 52 to 138.
On the first day of September 1937, Sir Cyril Newall took over Ellington's role as Chief of the Air Staff and forcefully continued the expansion plans as the threat of war became even more apparent. This threat was propagated when, in 1938, Germany annexed Austria, with the apparent enthusiasm of the Austrian population.
Neville Chamberlain, the Prime Minister of the coalition government in Britain, in a bid to try and cool the situation, flew to Munich for talks with Hitler, Mussolini and Daladier. He returned to England with the famous piece of paper signed by all 4, which purported to guarantee peace in our time. Very few people were convinced, however, but it did give the Royal Air Force the breathing space it needed, for the expansion program had still not reached by then a satisfactory level of fulfillment. The pace was stepped up. A further new command was formed, Balloon Command. The Women's Royal Air Force was also formed. The country's worst fears were realized when the German invasion of Poland began on September the 1st, 1939. And subsequently, 2 days later, after Hitler failed to respond to French and British ultimatums, war was declared. In September 1939, the strength of the Royal Air Force amounted to 1,476 aircraft in Britain and a further 435 stationed overseas. The total strength of the manpower amounted to 118,000 regulars and 60,000 reservists. Compared with the Luftwaffe's 3,600 aircraft and more than 500,000 serving personnel, the prospects ahead for the RAF were daunting. In addition to the already outstanding odds, the Luftwaffe also commanded another 500,000 personnel in anti-aircraft defenses. At the outbreak of war, Bomber Command, under the leadership of Air Chief Marshal Sir Ludlow Hewitt, mustered only 33 squadrons, the aircraft consisting of Wellingtons, Whitleys, Hamdens, Blenheims and Fairey Battles. 10 of these squadrons were dispatched to France as part of the Advanced Air Striking Force. In Britain, the remaining squadrons were not yet considered capable of delivering an effective bombing offence against Germany, so they were given 2 other directives by the War Cabinet. The only military attacks were to be against enemy warships at sea, and over land, orders were given to confine all flights to leaflet dropping over the German people. These propaganda missions began immediately, with many Whitley squadrons, sometimes supported by Wellingtons, operating at night. The leaflet raids showed the Germans that the RAF was capable of flying deep into their territory, and even as far as Berlin and Vienna. But there was another enemy confronting the RAF besides the German air defences on these raids. An enemy which was to haunt Bomber Command throughout the war: the winter weather. Losses were heavy, so heavy in fact that they were considered to be unacceptable for any sustained period of time. The attacks by Bomber Command against enemy warships began the day after war was declared, with a daylight strike by 10 Blenheims against the German pocket battleship Admiral von Scheer and the cruiser Emden. It was an extremely gallant attack, but unfortunately fruitless, and furthermore, 5 of the Blenheims were lost. At this time, the RAF believed that if squadrons of bombers flew in close formation on daylight raids on warships, the aircraft's front and rear machine gun turrets would render them almost invulnerable. The result was the opposite. The enemy fighters escorting the ships were picking them off at an alarming rate. On average, 10 RAF bombers were lost for every 4 German fighters being shot down. Bomber Command quickly came to recognize the need for long-distance fighter escorts if the bombers were to continue daylight raids, but these were not yet available at this stage of the war. Coastal Command entered the war with 3 groups: the west and east of England and Scotland, all under the command of Air Chief Marshal Sir Frederick Bowhill. The command's collection of aircraft consisted of Ansons, Lockheed Hudsons from America, the ancient Wildebeest torpedo bombers, Sunderlands, Londons and Stranraers. Their main enemy was the German U-boat. The third of the RAF's operational commands came under the leadership of Air Chief Marshal Sir Hugh Dowding. For the first few months of the war, Fighter Command was mainly concentrating on building up the strength of its squadrons. It was estimated that Britain would need 53 squadrons for the defence of the country, but they only started the war with 35. These were equipped with Hurricanes, Spitfires and Gloucester Gladiators. To meet the rapid demand, some of the new squadrons were temporarily equipped with Blenheims and Battles. To meet the demand for new aircrew, the Empire Training Scheme was formed, with the support of Canada, New Zealand, Australia, Rhodesia and South Africa, and recruits also coming in from Poland and Czechoslovakia. June 1940. Hitler stood on the shores of defeated France. Only one thing now stood in the way of the invasion of England: the English Channel. Hitler's invading army would have to cross this barrier of water. The British Army was still trying to recover after the heavy losses at Dunkirk. The men were demoralized. Their weapons and equipment lay abandoned. The Royal Navy was spread wide across the globe, trying to protect the shipping convoys from the German U-boats. The Royal Air Force had been overwhelmed in France. They had lost 450 aircraft, and an equal number of pilots had been reported killed, missing, or taken prisoner. Hitler told his people that Great Britain posed a threat to Germany as a base from which the RAF and the Navy could continue to wage war. In early July, he gave his plans to remove the threat and ordered the start of the build-up for an air and seaborne assault in England. To be assured an easy crossing for his troops, he gave orders to the Luftwaffe to destroy the RAF fighter defences to establish air supremacy. Great Britain, now alone with poor defences, prepared for the imminent invasion. If the Luftwaffe achieved their aim and knocked out the RAF, any attempt by the Royal Navy to attack the invasion barges without air cover would leave them at the mercy of the Luftwaffe and German Navy. The people of Great Britain held their breath. Then came the first attacks. Thousands of German bombers and fighters attacked the shipping convoys in the Channel. The attacks had the desired effect, for they lured out the RAF fighters. The RAF came at the Luftwaffe facing alarming odds of as many as 10 to 1. The German plan was to test the British air defences and cause them to use up precious reserves. The battles over the coastal convoys were vicious and costly to both sides, but the German losses were much higher. Hitler had not bargained for the sheer tenacity of the young RAF pilots. He turned his bombers onto the British ports on the south coast. The southern tip of England became known as Hellfire Corner. The Luftwaffe continued to sustain heavy losses, and although they were causing heavy damage to the supply convoys and ports, it was not enough to stop the flow of resources. The next phase was to try and knock out the fighters on the ground, destroying the runways and airfields in the process. But the RAF were prepared for this. Although their airfields were hit hard, many of the aircraft were saved, and still the RAF fought back. One advantage that the RAF did have was that the battle was fought over their own coastal waters and land. Many of the RAF pilots shot down either bailed out or made forced landings and were able to return once again to the fray. The Luftwaffe were not so fortunate in similar plight. They were either taken prisoner or in battle-damaged aircraft tried to return to France and were lost in the Channel. Goering had promised Hitler that his Luftwaffe would have cleared the skies of the RAF over Britain. It now appeared to Hitler that Goering's promise of air supremacy was a long way from the truth. He gave new orders to the Luftwaffe. They were not only to attack the airfields, but also begin attacking the industrial areas of England in an attempt to stop the British war machine. The RAF once again hit back hard. Despite heavy damage to the factories, production continued. The losses were now mounting on both sides. The RAF had suffered badly. By now they were down to only a few hundred aircraft. By comparison, although severely depleted, the Luftwaffe still had a complement of over 2,000. It was becoming painfully clear to the RAF that they could not keep up the defences very much longer. However, by contrast, the Luftwaffe, not knowing the enemy's plight, felt that the RAF resistance was far from decreasing. Despite the continuing raids on the airfields, they were not being knocked out for any appreciable amount of time. Unaware of the RAF's low strength, Hitler made an incalculable error. He gave orders to end the attacks on the airfields and to concentrate on bombing the prize target, London. This was the reprieve the RAF needed. They now had time to regroup and rearm. Wave after wave of German aircraft bore down on the almost defenseless city. but the pressure was off the RAF's sorely pressed airfields. On September 15th, at the height of the battle, massive formations of German bombers showed up on the radar screens. As they flew in from the coast towards London, the RAF were alerted. In an area 60 miles long, 38 miles wide, and at a height of 5 miles, one of the most historic battles ever took place. The RAF rose to the Luftwaffe challenge. They put up almost every fighter they had. Outnumbered 6-1, they locked horns with the enemy. The British pilots flung themselves relentlessly at the vast horde of Black Cross bombers and fighters. Although this had been Britain in her darkest hour, this was the turning point of the war. By October 12th, Hitler had postponed his invasion plans indefinitely. Britain, for the time being, was safe. Although the raids did continue night after night up until the end of the year, the increasing strength of the RAF riding high on the victory in battle ensured that Hitler would never again be able to contemplate invasion. During the Battle of Britain, only the RAF's fighter pilots stood between Britain and the planned Nazi invasion. One of the most legendary of these champions of the air was Douglas Bader, an amazing character who had lost both legs during a pre-war flying accident. In spite of his somewhat precarious disability, he was a man with a forceful disposition, and it was due to this great inner strength that the RAF were persuaded to let Bader fly operationally when the war started. He was very soon promoted to Flight Lieutenant of 222 Squadron when he claimed his first enemy kill by shooting down an Me-110 over Dunkirk. In July 1940, he was given command of 242 Squadron, a unit comprising mainly Canadian pilots who had been withdrawn, demoralized from France. Bader had a firm belief in his ideas of air warfare, which quite often the Air Ministry were forced to listen to. It was his idea that more damage could be inflicted on the German bombers by much larger formations of fighters. This led to a heated argument between AOC Trafford Leigh-Mallory and his 11th Group commander Keith Park. By September 1940, however, his theory was put into regular practice and the big wing formations were soon standard procedure. During the Battle of Britain, he was constantly leading his large formations of Hurricanes and Spitfires into the conflict with devastating results for the enemy. It was at this time when Bader was awarded the DSO for his bravery. From a very early stage in his career, Bader had laid down certain precedents for fighter pilots in the combat area. They should dive down to the enemy formation to try and break it up, and always with the sun behind them. Never, under any circumstances, follow a damaged opponent down, hoping for a kill, for a pilot would be a sitting target for any enemy fighters above. Straggling behind was disastrous. The lone fighter would be easy prey for hostile guns. Bader's concept worked, and very soon, Leigh-Mallory began to call 242 the Disintegration Squadron. In October 1940, Hitler's planned invasion was postponed, and he turned his bombers onto the cities of Britain. By this time, Bader was commanding no fewer than 5 squadrons. In March 1941, he was promoted to wing commander and became one of the first wing leaders. He made many kills over the French coastal areas. On August the 9th, however, he made his last. He had just shot down 2 109s when he was attacked and his aircraft hit. With the aircraft in flames, he had to bail out, losing his 2 artificial legs in the process. He landed in enemy territory and was immediately taken prisoner. Amazingly, a report came via German radio intelligence that they were requesting a new set of legs for Bader and that they would give permission for a British plane to land. The RAF, however, opted for a different method and dropped a new set of legs from a Blenheim during a bombing raid. Barder was taken to a POW camp, but he attempted to escape. He was caught, after which he made several more escape attempts, until finally he was taken to Colditz Castle, the camp for constant escapees. It was here that he remained for the rest of the war. Liberated on the 14th of April 1945, he returned to England, where he was promoted to group captain and commanding officer of the Fighter Leaders School at Tangmere. When the RAF performed the flypast in 1945 over London to mark the victory, Barder was out front in the lead fighter, one of the greatest characters of the war and one of the finest leaders.
During the Second World War, not only did the RAF make an outstanding contribution to victory, it also made remarkable progress in the development of aircraft and avionic technology. The early twin-engined heavy bombers were replaced with the mighty four-engine machines, the Stirling, the Halifax, and the magnificent Lancaster.
Many aircraft employed by the combatants of the Second World War became famous, but few were truly great. For greatness is a quality which cannot be instilled in an aircraft on the drawing board or the assembly line. A great aircraft must have that touch of genius which transcends the good, and above all, it must have luck. The luck to be in the right place at the right time. It must have flying qualities above the average, reliability, ruggedness and fighting ability, and in the final analysis, it needs a skilled touch of cruise to which it has endeared itself. The Avro Lancaster had all of these things, and more. It embodied a measure of grace which made it pleasing on the eye, and its neat aerodynamic shape contributed materially to its excellent all-round performance. But like so many good aeroplanes, the essence of its design was its simplicity, its robust structure being ideally suited for mass production, and this was undoubtedly one of the main factors of its success. It was also remarkably adaptable and a superlative bomber on every count. And of all the great aeroplanes of World War II, there were many who would insist that this was the greatest. The bomb load of the Lancaster was tremendous, on normal operations 14,000 pounds, but with modifications it could carry the 22,000-pound Grand Slam. 4 Packard-built Merlin engines powered the mighty bomber, giving a maximum speed of 270 miles per hour at 19,000 feet. The legendary Bomber Harris, commander of Bomber Command, stated that they were undoubtedly the finest bombers of the war, both in performance and in the way it could be saddled with ever-increasing bomb loads without breaking the camel's back. But not only could it take heavier bomb loads, and not only was it easier to handle, it also had a much lower casualty rate than other bombers. This was perhaps the main reason as to why it was so popular amongst its crews. It was also modified Lancasters that carried out the remarkable Dam Busters raid, with the brainchild of Barnes-Wallis, the bouncing bomb.
We went in first, before Les night, after we'd been round 2 or 3 times, dropped our mine, saw it explode, and the water came up about 1,000 feet, the spurt of water was, and we knocked about 9 feet from the top of the dam, and the Ada Dam was breached, and we circled around and watched the water pouring through, saw cars on the road down below being submerged, the lights gradually subdued until you couldn't see them anymore. And Gibson said that's good, because he was flying around all the time watching us. And he said, now get back to base, which we did. And on the raid, we sent out 19 planes, and 2 had to turn back because they were damaged on the way. And so we lost 8 out of 17, really, which was quite a lot.
It was also at this time that another outstanding aircraft made its debut, one that proved to be an invaluable asset to the RAF in its multi-role capability.
Many of the world's greatest combat aircraft have been born not as the result of some officially inspired specification, but because of the unshakable conviction of one man or a group of individuals in a revolutionary idea. No better example of this could be cited than the de Havilland Mosquito, which diverged so far from the official views pertaining at the time of its conception that this magnificent aircraft was almost never born at all. With the prospects of a world war looming, the designers at de Havilland quickly realized that the metalworking industries were going to have their hands full, but the materials and manpower of the furniture-making industries were not going to be needed. Rather than these resources going to waste, why not build a wooden aircraft? Furthermore, the concept was to build a bomber with fighter instincts, an aircraft that could carry a substantial bomb load, and its main defense against enemy fighters would be its ability to outrun them and outmaneuver them in combat, something that the Mosquito's rival in the Royal Air Force, the Bristol Blenheim, severely lacked. It was the de Havilland Company alone that can take the full credit for this aircraft, for against all of the opposition at the time, they went ahead with their belief in the rightness of this formula and produced for the Royal Air Force one of the most potent weapons of the Second World War. The essence of the Mosquito was the combination of many proven elements: 2 Rolls-Royce Merlin engines, the smallest practical airframe, extreme aerodynamic cleanliness, and a high power-to-weight ratio. The result was a flying machine which surpassed any other operational aircraft available at the time, and its most amazing attribute was its incredible versatility, which as the war progressed resulted in the aircraft being known as all things to all men, a claim which took until the introduction of the Tornado decades later to rival. It was a constant thorn in the enemy's flesh. Whether it was disrupting gatherings addressed by Germany's war leaders deep in the heart of German territory, attacking Gestapo headquarters at rooftop height, or merely keeping Berliners in their air raid shelters, the Mosquitoes were front-page news. Aesthetically, the Mosquito was one of the most appealing combat aircraft designs ever evolved. And like most really beautiful airplanes, it possessed delightful flying characteristics. It radically altered the course of bomber concepts and set records of progress from initial drawings to flight tests, and from flight testing to actual operational use with the RAF squadrons. As a bomber of all-wood construction, the Mosquito was unique. In its multi-role variants, it was outstanding, and it possessed that highly desirable but all too rare ability to make a pilot feel part and parcel of his aircraft. It was loved by the crews because more than any other aircraft and bomber command, it was the one that would get them home. It captured popular imagination from the moment its first daring sorties over Europe became known, and its sensational exploits continued to sustain worldwide interest and enthusiasm to a greater degree than those of any other combat aircraft. The Mosquito could carry phenomenal loads over extremely long distances, performing feats out of all proportion to the specification originally envisaged by its designers. In short, the Mosquito was an outstanding warplane on every count, and if perhaps it was overshadowed by the Spitfires being the most popular aircraft in the war, it was certainly the most popular with the men that flew them. One of those men was Group Captain Leonard Cheshire. During World War II, many VCs were won, none more deserving than that awarded to Cheshire, possibly one of the most courageous men of the war. Cheshire's operational career in the RAF began in June 1940. Against strongly defended targets, he soon showed that extra courage and determination of the exceptional leader. He was always ready to accept additional risks to ensure the success of a mission. Defying the formidable Ruhr defense system, he frequently flew in and released his bomb load from a much lower level than called for, thus obtaining much more accurate results on the target. Over Cologne in November 1940, an anti-aircraft shell burst right inside his aircraft, blowing out one side completely and starting a fire. Undeterred, Cheshire went on to bomb the target and still made it home. In 1943, he took command of the legendary 617 Squadron and opened his 4th operational tour as wing commander. His first impact on the squadron came when he began to devise a fresh way of ensuring accurate attacks against comparatively small targets. This developed into a totally new marking system, which was to use a marker aircraft flying in first to mark the target at much lower heights than the bomber force. This new system of Cheshire's also coincided with the development of the 12,000-pound blast bomb. The first raid was on the aircraft factory at Limoges on 8th of February. Cheshire led 12 Lancasters through cloud to reach the target in moonlight. In the lead aircraft, Cheshire then dipped down to 200 feet over the factory, dropping his ordnance of incendiaries right on the target. These burst at once, sending out a glow of red spot fires. The remaining bombers in the stream behind at 7,000 feet now had a perfect point at which to aim, and the raid was a complete success. It soon transpired to Cheshire that there was an urgent need to mark targets with a much faster and more manoeuvrable aircraft than the Lancaster. He was very soon given 2 Mosquitoes, which were perfect for the task. It was the famous Munich raid which helped win Cheshire his Victoria Cross. 4 Mosquitoes were to make the first markings of the target. The pilots were Wing Commander Cheshire, Flight Lieutenant Kearns, Squadron Leader Shannon, and Flight Lieutenant Falk. Cheshire was to mark a small house on the railway sidings, which he did with remarkable accuracy. But the sheer mark of the man and his courage can be seen when, having marked his target, he continued to fly around the target with no regard to his low reserve on fuel. He directed the 200 Lancasters into the area, flying at only 1,000 feet, immediately below the path of their falling bombs. With the task complete, Cheshire set course for home, only to face flying through 40 miles of heavy flak. On approaching RAF Manston, his fuel gauge read only 10 minutes of fuel left, only to find that there were enemy fighters over the airfield shooting up the landing aircraft. He calmly switched off all his lights, and with all landing lights on the airfield extinguished, he landed the Mosquito in complete darkness. This was just one of his many exploits, and although he led 617 Squadron on some 40 similar raids, the true measure of his wartime achievement was in his brilliant inventiveness and leadership. He was a man who would always back his own judgment, and events proved him right, time and time again. In all, he flew 100 missions. 100 times he had gone out, bombed, endured ack-ack, fought fear and tiredness and cold, excerpted all his skill, all his ingenuity, and come back. He had forgotten all else in life other than leading his squadron, setting an example of frozen courage in every attack, bombing, shattering and killing the enemy. To mark his achievements of determined leadership and courage over a long period, King George invested Cheshire with his 3rd DSO and the Victoria Cross. The citation read, "Wing Commander Cheshire led his squadron personally on every occasion, always undertaking the most difficult task himself."
The Spitfire and the Hurricane went through many variations and were the mainstay of fighter command, although there were later additions to the force with the Typhoon and the Tempest. It wasn't only British aircraft that the RAF was using. Under the Lend-Lease agreement, the United States supplied a whole variety of aircraft.
The Curtiss P-40, the Thunderbolt, the Corsair, the Avenger, the Airacobra, the Ventura, and the formidable Mustang. Bomber Command took delivery of the American Mitchell, the Marauder, the Boston, and the Liberator, whilst Coastal Command had the Catalina and the Hudson. Overseas, the RAF were using the workhorse of World War II, the DC-3 Dakota.
To give a full account of the Royal Air Force's activities during the Second World War would require volumes of films such as this. To condense the magnitude of achievements into a few minutes would not be doing justice to the outstanding chapters in the annals of the RAF history. Perhaps more importantly, we'd not be doing justice to the many tens of thousands of men and women that lost their lives in helping to write those chapters. Whilst the RAF did lose a great many brave young men and women, especially if they had the misfortune to end up in Bomber Command, a great many more survived, some only just.
When you're in a fighter that has been hit and catches fire, the cockpit is engulfed in flames within seconds. When a mighty bomber ignites, there is not long before the massive fuel tanks go up too. Many airmen suffered horrific injuries during the war, but there was one group which formed a bond between them that exists to this very day, the members of the Guinea Pig Club. It is said that through adversity comes strength. well, these men found an inner strength despite the most appalling injuries and disfigurement. A strength which they proudly displayed to the nation. A strength which was and still is a reminder of the courage and determination of the members of the Royal Air Force.
If you're having a tough time on your own, it's difficult. But don't forget, the numbers of guinea pigs that went through the hospital were 647. And when they're all together, they were all young men. They're all men, I think, with tremendous sense of humour. And it's this comradeship in which they help each other. In other words, through adversity, you find your strength. And it's remarkable because most of them have succeeded in life, whereas really you would expect them to fail. And I think we can be of great value to other people in this respect.
After the Second World War, the RAF had emerged as perhaps the premier air force of the world. Possibly not in size, although it had reached colossal numbers, but as an air force which had, against outstanding odds, surpassed itself in the eyes of the world. But the post-war period was soon to prove that a different type of air force was needed, and that the rules of air warfare were going to be rewritten many times in the years ahead.